And a very warm welcome. You're joining us here at Hyde Park on Other Derana 24. And tonight on the news channel, we'll be talking about the heightened geopolitical tensions as we speak and how Sri Lanka is going to face the repercussions of the war in Middle East and the consequences as a result of supply chains constrained, and how ongoing diplomatic engagements with the rest of the world will work. I have diverse perspectives represented here at Hyde Park. Let me very warmly welcome former Deputy Minister of State Enterprise Development, a former State Minister of Finance and a member of the Committee on Public Enterprises, Iran Wickramaratne. A very warm welcome to you.
Thank you.
I believe we'll be able to talk much about the developments here and externally, but essentially how Sri Lanka's economy is going to face the consequences of the challenges. Also joining us tonight, we have with us Dr. Ravi Rannan Elia, economist and chairman of the Institute for Health Policy, widely respected for his research and economic policy. And I believe we'll be able to talk about the short to medium term implications and what in the long term will be Sri Lanka's game plan and also response to manage the fallout from a war. Also joining us tonight, third perspective, Mr. Santosh Menon, who is the president of the Lanka India Business Association. And I believe we'll be able to have much insight into region and trade and business relations between Sri Lanka and India as we continue this conversation in the next hour. To begin with, I'd like to speak with our former Minister of Finance, State Minister of Finance and Deputy Minister for State Enterprise Development. How do you look at the developments in the Middle East and how Sri Lanka has responded so far? It is going to be a difficult time. That's what we hear. But how difficult is it going to be for the Sri Lankan economy and industries here, at least to begin with, the outward-looking industries?
Yes, so I think the first thing that must be stated is that it's an external shock. So it's not something that a government has responsible for in that sense. Governments are responsible in how we will respond to it. So it's an external shock and it has various implications, not just only for Sri Lanka, it will have implications globally and for many countries as well. And the smaller countries, maybe the impact is going to be much greater. So one is the cost of energy itself, because if fuel prices keep climbing, and you can probably stabilize it for a while. So then the question arises is how long will the conflict go on for? Because by handling the supplies, you can probably stabilize it and releasing stocks and things like that. But fuel prices is certainly a concern. Then coal will be another one because we use it for energy as well. Then the other thing is the gas, and a lot of these percentage-wise, whether it's fuel or it's gas, a lot of it comes from the Middle Eastern countries. Fertilizer is less of a concern because it comes from China. So in that sense, price-wise, I would say it would probably less of a concern. But there may be, again, it's a demand-supply issue and how it will affect. So prices rise, inflation and inflation on day-to-day goods, both consumer as well as it can impact production, and that would probably be one of the issues that will certainly we will have to contend with. Then lots of Sri Lankans, as you know, also work in the Middle East, right? And remittances keep coming, and if there is a lot of disruption there, particularly in their businesses, and Sri Lankans working there, it's still too early to say whether the unemployment rates might go up. And if it does, then the remittances will also be affected. So that's something we have to closely watch because we are a country which is quite dependent on our remittances as well. Then the Middle East, as you know, is air transport and a air logistics hub, right? And there's a lot of disruption there at the moment. So that could cause some issues with our tourism, because tourism has been increasing, and a lot of cancellations and things would be coming in, and so that could affect our tourist incomes as well. So these are some of the things that look straight away that could be impacted in terms
But do you think the Sri Lankan economy can withstand these shocks? We've had multiple blows on the economy, and in the last decade, this has been more severe than before. And it seems that after an economic crisis, the problem is still not over.
Yeah, so as I said, this is an external shock that has come in, and the immediate impacts will be there. That's not avoidable. I think answering your question about, what's the resilience, how can we come out of this, what can happen, I think there are lots of other things that need to be done, you see, which could really help us. With every crisis, I think there are opportunities also. So you have to handle the crisis, the immediate impact of the crisis. But I think there are opportunities that will also come with it. Because if you take supply chains and routes and all, Sri Lanka, one way to look at it is, suddenly we become important as well. Because with the Strait of Hormuz, virtually coming to a standstill in terms of supply of, oil and gas and things like that. And then we are obviously located naturally on one of the busiest east-west routes, you see. So that will bring some opportunities as well, and it will also bring some challenges to us, being a small country, and how we actually navigate it and handle it and so forth. But immediately I would say it's a negative, but I would look at it a little bit more midterm and say certainly we can come out of it. There may be reforms that we may have to do to create the environment for it. And so therefore I'm not completely negative, though I can see immediately that there are problems.
Right.
And governments might have to take some short-term measures. Countries in Asia have taken short-term measures, particularly in energy conservation and all, and we may have to take some short-term measures.
Right. I think I intend talking about the opportunities and what short-term measures in the immediate term that we can look at. But at the same time, turning to Dr. Ranan earlier, we're talking about how long this war is going to continue. And there are warnings that if this continues beyond 45 days, there are going to be severe repercussions on the world economy, with growth rates strangulated and finances mismatched. And US President Donald Trump, he did say on Monday that during a press conference that the war will be over very quickly, but later, 2 days later, on Truth Social, he said it will take longer than anticipated with Iran, except unconditional surrender. Iran says otherwise. They say no surrender, and that Tehran would not allow the export of a single liter of oil. What are the repercussions of the global economy? I think former Minister Iran Wickramaratne spoke about the implications on Sri Lanka, whether it's oil, gas, or even coal. And the Strait of Hormuz, which plays a significant role here, is under threat.
So I would just say, Iran mentioned, he reeled off a list of items which I would agree with in terms of the immediate impacts. In terms of their effects on the global economy, all those things that he mentioned, that of course does ultimately affect our growth prospects, but of course everyone gets affected by this, not just Sri Lanka. So it does mean a more challenging growth environment for the next few months, maybe the next year. So that's one thing I would say. But in terms of how long this would last, I think what you asked, I think honestly nobody has any idea how long this would last. President Trump has no idea. His administration doesn't have any idea. I don't think the Israelis have any idea, and the Iranians don't have any idea. So that's the reality. And I suspect, one thing I would just mention, one effect on the global economy, Iran might have better knowledge of how this will affect us, that is already happening, is the effect on US bond markets. So I think there's been like a 30 basis points increase in bonds in the past week or so, which is quite a dramatic increase. And I think that the markets have systematically underpriced, A, the risk of this conflict, even though lots of people in Israel said this is going to happen, that there's going to be another war in a few months after the 12-day war. They have systematically underestimated the risk of the conflict. They've systematically underestimated the risk of a closure of the Straits of Hormuz. In fact, Trump and some of his people seem to have been a bit surprised that this happened, which I find a bit shocking. I suspect people in the US national security establishment, foreign policy establishment probably did know this, but whether that goes through to the president is a different issue. And so they've underpriced all these things. And then even you saw the past 48 hours, these gyrations in the oil price. Instant reaction was, oh, the war is going to be over. And then after about 36 hours, people realized, no, that's not going to be all over that soon. So I think the reality is the markets have underpriced the risks. And I think the bond markets may go further southwards, so will the oil price will go upwards, I guess. So but the problem is we don't know how long. And the reason we don't know or anybody knows is, and I think it's important to understand this, the Israelis and the Americans who started this have very different objectives. Their interests are not aligned. I don't think the United States sees in its interest that there should be a lot of destruction to the global economy, right? I mean, I don't think the US would ever want that. That's a good thing. And I don't think they would want to see extensive damage to the economies of the Gulf allies, the Gulf states. But Israel does not care. So Israel, I mean, there have been media reports that people in the Prime Minister's office in Jerusalem have said, yeah, I mean, if Iran becomes a failed state, that's still a good outcome for Israel, because their objective is to diminish Iran's geopolitical influence in the region, and that's their strategic objective. America's interests are different, right? So now we've got ourselves into a position where I think the Iranians, and they've clearly communicated this, that their problem now is even if the conflict, if there's a ceasefire imposed, or a unilateral ceasefire from the American side, the Iranians' view is, well, we can't stop you attacking us again in a year's time, 2 years' time. We know what you will do. This is a 50-year history of, let's say, aggression against Iran by the United States since the 1979 revolution, rightly or wrongly, but that's the history. And now, what are we going to do? So we can't go back to a situation where we're under sanctions and you just stop firing at us, and then for the next 2 years maybe you rearm. There's bipartisan consensus in America right now for regime change in Iran. So let's be honest about it, it's not just the Republicans, it's many of the Democrats. And so we're just going to get weaker. So I think what the Iranians now face they've said, existential challenge. They can't let the war end at this point unless they have an outcome that guarantees them some chance of reconstructing in a credible way. And I think that's the problem. And right now, I don't think the Americans are at that point. The Israelis, of course, have their own objectives. So I think that's why we don't know. We don't know how long it will take for the United States to recognize this, or the Trump administration. I think many Americans do recognize this, to be fair. But how long is it going to take for them, and how willing is he going to be to make whatever adjustments or concessions are going to be made to meet the Iranians at a point where they can mutually end this? And I think the Iranians right now, they're probably quite happy for the global economy to be damaged until they can get themselves into a better position where they don't face this again in 2 or 3 years' time. So I think that's the big uncertainty. So I think that for us, yes, we have an immediate problem, but we have to think that there is a significant probability that this could last 4 or 5 months, right? I don't think it will last 9 months, because at that point the pressure on the administration in the US, because the midterm elections will be such that they will want to stop this, right? I mean, this is already damaging them. The MAGA base, Trump's MAGA base, half of it is split and is horrified, right? Many of the influencers you can see have openly criticized Trump, which is very unusual. But I think that that's sort of the upper limit. But the Iranians have planned for this, right? The Americans and Israelis thought they could achieve regime change in a short strike. That didn't happen. The Iranians have proved far more resilient. They planned for this. And so I think we should plan for the possibility of a 4-month closure, for example. What will that do to us? Well, there'll be supply at a higher price. But I think we need to figure out how we proactively plan. And I think at the moment, and Iran maybe want to comment, I think my sense is the current reaction of the government is very reactive. Yeah, we'll increase prices, I think, Tuesday, right? We increased prices for petrol. Because they said, because that's the price formula, that's the price, not the landed stuff, but the price in the source country has gone up, so that's why we increased it. Okay, fine. But I think they need to be moving far more aggressively to manage consumption. Other Southeast Asian countries are ahead of us on this, right? Some countries have introduced 4-day weeks. There's several governments in Southeast Asia, some of whom have their own oil and gas, who are telling the public, businesses, to curtail consumption, right? So we have, I think, to seriously think about using the price signal to further curtail consumption, to put us in a more resilient position. And I think there's a political opportunity for the government to explain that to people and get away with it. And then the other thing I would say is that we need, I think, to take lessons from China's strategy. The Chinese are probably going to be the least affected of all the major Asian economies. Even though people say, they get a lot of Iranian crude. In fact, all the Iranian crude goes to China, actually. Most of it, 90%. The Chinese, expected this for a year, and they stockpiled. We have not stockpiled. We have some fuel tanks in Trincomalee, which this government, the previous government, even Iran's government, I have to say, talked a lot about doing something about those oil tanks, but nothing has happened in the past decade, right? I mean, we have not built oil storage facilities. We could have stored some of that Iranian crude, which is on the sea, or Russian crude. We could have had that in Trincomalee, but we haven't done that, right? So that's one serious mission. Where our bureaucracy, I don't know if it's bureaucracy or it's a political issue, Iran can better comment, but we tend to be very slow at implementing any kind of decision. So that's one problem. I think we should be thinking about storage. And then the other big thing, again, learning from China, is I think we should be accelerating the transition to an electrified economy, which essentially means electric cars. And right now, it's happening passively because electric cars are cheaper, and some of the importers, I think half our imports now are electric cars, right? So that's just a response to price signals. But I think we should be having a much more proactive strategy, learn from Southeast Asia and China, to further accelerate that, which would improve our resilience against these kinds of shocks.
Right.
And given the possibility that this will not end in a clean outcome, and that the fact the US establishment, including the Democrats, many of them still will want regime change. I mean, there's a visceral hostility to, I've lived in America, right? I've been to Iran as well, and I've been to Israel on work, but there's a visceral hostility. And most Americans do not fully understand Iran. So I think this is a tragedy. So I think there's a high likelihood of continued conflicts. I think we do need to build long-term resilience that way.
I'd like to speak further on that, but I think we cannot ignore India's influence in the region. And the very reason why we invited Hugh is because of your deep insights into businesses, investments, and how South Asian trade can happen. We saw in recent times the Iranian warships and the response by both Sri Lanka and India. But at the same time, there are grave concerns facing businesses and industries of the two economies. India, the net security provider of the region, and still we're wondering how much of the war's influence will be in this part of the region and how this region is going to work together. But essentially, how can our industries and businesses work together to have stronger bridges?
Well, I think the fact is this war is impacting everybody, especially in this part of the world. So in as much as Sri Lanka is impacted, I think India too is having its own share of figuring out how to address some of the issues that might come up as a result of the current situation. But I do think that given the fact that both Iran and Ravi mentioned and talked about the short-term and medium-term issues related to the problem that arises due to the situation, I think this is also an opportunity to start looking at the Sri Lanka-India relationship in a slightly different way. You know, at the end of the day, the fulcrum of wealth, and I use this term in a very meaningful way, earlier it used to be the Gulf and the West, because a lot of the consumption used to happen in the West, and there used to be a gateway between the East and the West, and products used to move from the East to the West. In reality, in 2026, that gateway is moving eastwards, where actually 50% of the GDP is happening in Asia. In a sense, Sri Lanka is wonderfully placed to be that fulcrum and actually be the place from where a lot of the transactions and the economy, the movements can happen. But I think there's also a necessity for Sri Lanka to look at India and integrating in some way economically with India as a way forward to address some of these possible shocks that are likely to happen. And I'll give you two examples. I mean, one example is New Zealand, and Canada. Both countries, small countries with large neighbors. In 1983 is when New Zealand actually created what is called a close economic relationships pact with Australia. As a result of that, the per capita GDP of New Zealand, which at that time in 83 used to be $7,000 is today around $52,000 US. In the same way, Canada used to be around 19,000 per capita GDP, and now it's around $53,000 US. There has been a tremendous benefit in integrating with a larger neighbor. And I think given these kind of situations which are likely to arise more and more because of the fragmenting nature of the world in today's context, the Cold War is over and it seems like as if the West is on the decline, and there seems to be a lot of moving pieces geopolitically, and these kind of shocks are likely to happen. My view is this is probably the thing that needs to kind of drive a closer interaction between India and Sri Lanka, given that India is literally 500 nautical miles from your northern border.
With all this, with the current developments, do you see corporates already shifting? We spoke about the Strait of Hormuz and how supply chains are constrained, but do you see corporates, especially in India, looking at alternative routes and establishing stronger ties?
No, I think from what I understand, the Strait of Hormuz provides 20% of the oil that comes into the region. I mean, I think from an Indian perspective, I think there's a fairly diversified source of petroleum. I think the issue that India currently seems to be facing is one of natural gas, where a large part of the natural gas into India comes from the Strait of Hormuz. I think it's a 12-day situation as we speak. It's the 12th day of the war. But I think if this continues like our gentleman here just mentioned, that this probably will go on for 4 months, I'm sure many other considerations will come into play. The role of the Gulf, what happens to offices there, corporates there, how do they operate, how do they engage with India? All of those questions will then, I think, get asked. But at the current moment, I think everyone's just keeping their fingers crossed and hoping that this war ends quickly and that better sense prevails, and that some of this, the rhetoric will end and actual action will happen to kind of brings this thing to a close.
Right. And I think it's very important to also pick up on these comments made about India, the importance of Sri Lanka working more closely with Indian industries, and the immediate changes or decisions that the Sri Lankan administration should take. You mentioned about the short-term measures and the opportunities that we see ahead. But at the same time, I think Ravi mentioned about stockpiling. So as we talk about that, I think this has been a major political debate as well. The president himself said this was impossible because previous regimes, regimes that you have also been part of, had not prepared ahead.
Yes, I think that's a valid point. Now, you know, I always say this, the issue with Sri Lanka is the issue of handling your big countries, India in particular, because obviously it's regionally the big, and the big and the small. And, you know, so we have to really figure out how we do it. There is no question that India being our closest neighbor geographically, and also culturally, the closest neighbor is a very important part of how we navigate our future. The rise of the Indian economy, certainly I agree, gives small countries like Sri Lanka tremendous opportunity, and those opportunities must be exploited, the benefit of raising the living standards of our people. And continuously we have to actually be at it. This particular reference that Dr. Rananelli also made about the oil tanks and all these have stopped short because of, if I can put it like this, big and small fears, you see, and sometimes we haven't made what we should be doing in terms of decisions, saying this is the economically, logically proper decision to actually make, you see, and we haven't made those decisions. I remember even when we were trying to you know, bring in other companies and not only have the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation for the import and distribution of oil, some years ago, you know, what debates we went through, and finally, you know, we got there. And that was really reversing the policies of nationalization of, you know, 50, 60 years ago, but now again, you know, realizing it. So I think economically, I think there is absolutely no argument that we have to exploit the opportunities, and we have to work closely, and we have to benefit from it. Sri Lanka is a small island with a very independent history, and you know, the cornerstone is we're always preserving our independence and our sovereignty and all, and that has been made clear through every government post-independence, that we are friends of all and enemies of none. Sometimes, you know, in making pragmatic decisions, you also come across ethical kind of issues. For example, the present crisis that we are facing, and this, you know, Iranian, you know, ship, which actually was not a warship, but, you know, and lots of these people across the world came to India, and then on their way out, they have been destroyed, lots of people have died, and Sri Lanka did the right thing. We immediately moved in on a humanitarian basis in actually intervening to take care of those people. But I think the issue there is not just humanitarian, and I must emphasize this, it's upholding international law. And I think this is very important. If the world order is to preserve, right, there are some things that we have to have in common. And unfortunately, in the last couple of years in particular, you know, the whole world order is, in a sense, you know, under threat or shaking. And I think that we need to have a commitment that we will hold to international law. Then even in the international law of the sea, right, there are definitions given in terms of you know, your exclusive zone, and you know, in terms of maritime protection and security and so forth. So I think upholding the law is important, and if I were to say, the government of Sri Lanka should be bringing this issue, right, at least regionally, because there are international laws, there are regional organizations, maritime organizations, and we should be actually bringing it there that actually in an exclusive economic zone that ship has been actually destroyed, and bring it up, because then everybody is concerned. These issues are not just confined to Sri Lanka. These are
with the U.S. Secretary of War explicitly stating that the U.S. does not care about international institutions or the rules of engagement. Do you think this is still relative?
Yes, in a way. Governments will come, governments will go, presidents will come, presidents will go, right? And the comment you made, I don't think is necessarily shared by all Americans either. And I think Dr. Ranan earlier very clearly stated that the objectives of the US will also differ from the objectives of Israel. There are some common things and there are lots of different things. So I think that what we are doing here, it's not the small fight in the big. Because if you take the Colombo Ocean Conclave, with India, and then we have smaller countries like Maldives and Mauritius and Sri Lanka, at least the government should be surfacing it there. We have a moral responsibility to do it. So that's why I said sometimes ethics and pragmatism, conflicts, and I think we should certainly do that. So. That's the one thing I think that I would say, as I said, it's an external shock and I don't blame a government for it, but I think how we respond, governments have to take responsibility for how we respond. Another point I would like to stress is what Dr. Ranan earlier said about other countries, because there's a lot of uncertainty. We don't know how long this will go on for, what the long-term implications will be. Now, short-term is one and the longer term. And Southeast Asian countries have actually moved fairly quickly in basically measures on energy saving. So on one side is, other stockpile, and we got the examples, about China and even other countries in the region. And Sri Lanka hasn't, and that was one of the failures. But we should certainly, I would say, look at the other measures that Southeast Asian countries have done on energy saving. From transport, and some countries have gone to look at schools, how many days they should function. So they have looked at the commercial establishments and businesses, how they should function, and then to save energy, and some are encouraging, working from home and things like that. So I think that's something that needs to be looked at immediately because of the uncertainty that is there.
Right. I think as global conflicts are reshaping economies and how countries work with one another, the question remains how prepared Sri Lanka is going forward. We'll come back to discuss all this after this short break. Do stay with us at Hyde Park. Welcome back. We're in conversation about the Middle East conflict and the ripple effects on the global economy, and in fact how Sri Lanka is going to respond to the growing challenges as tensions escalate in the Middle East. I'd like to turn to Dr. Ranan earlier. You mentioned the immediate steps the Sri Lankan economy should take, but what would you say policymakers should prioritize now, given the fact that we were not ready? We don't have enough or sufficient responses to the challenges that we see ahead.
So I think the problem, and it's long-standing, is that we tend to be very reactive to international developments and a bit of a laggard compared to other regional countries. We don't really look at what other countries do in the region, Southeast Asia, East Asia, and we don't really learn from them. And in fact, one thing I would just say, I know people think of the NPP as being a leftist government, or NPP, JVP government as being leftist, but actually they don't really understand China, right? So I mean, if the Chinese Communist Party, to be honest, has a much better understanding of markets than maybe our government does. So I think that's something we should, probably a better understanding of the US political establishment as well. So in terms of immediate things, I think that clearly there's a risk that oil prices will stay high for some time, may well go higher. There is a risk of curtailment of supply, which is partly mitigated by the price increase. So what we need to do in the short run, we should be doing much taking much more aggressive action, as Iran also confirmed, like other countries, to curtail consumption, to extend the supply that we have, given that we don't quite know when we're going to get that next tanker, right? I mean, this is the reality. So we should be acting proactively. And I think what I would do is, instead of trying to ration things, obviously we have a rationing mechanism, I think, still in place from the last administration. I guess it can be reactivated if necessary. But the main thing is the price signal. Now, they've only increased prices because that was sort of a reactive price formula thing. But what I would be doing right now is saying, no, there's a significant risk that prices or supply will be affected in the medium term. The problem will get worse. We can't wait till it gets worse. And we should be taking steps to control consumption. So I would be raising the price more than the price formula. And one thing I would do is, because it's always hard to raise prices, right? I mean, politically, whichever government it is, it's a political challenge, right? I'm sure everyone's been in those shoes before. But the reality is that the government could just be very candid to people and say, look, we face a significant crisis, not of our own doing, but the country faces a significant risk. We could run out of fuel, and they have some political capital to take some immediate action as a mitigation measure. And what I would do is I'd probably raise the price. Essentially, that's what a tax is. And I would maybe say, I'm going to use the money for two kinds of things. One is, I think there's also a risk. I mean, there are already stranded Sri Lankans, I think, in the Middle East. I mean, they can't fly out, right? Or they have to go through Oman or somewhere. And that's that. And then things get much worse. Now, we have to hope that they don't completely close the straits, because there's food that has to go into the Gulf. People forget about those Gulf states are extremely dependent on food imports as well as desalinated water. So if you cut those things off, and the Israelis couldn't care two hoots. They could easily try and instigate that. But if that happens, then life is not tolerable for people, for millions of people, many of them Sri Lankans living there. So we should say, we need to stockpile money to help get those Sri Lankans out to run relief flights. I think that's one thing we could say as an argument. The other thing we should do is we should invest some of the money, say, look, we're taking the money, we're going to invest it in accelerating electrification of the economy. Because right now, electrification is a very passive process right now in Sri Lanka. There's still not a very aggressive strategy compared to East Asia. We should be investing in the grid, we could be investing in storage, we could be investing in better policy to encourage rollout of electric cars. It's very, very passive, as I said, based on price signals only. So I think that's what the government should say. Take this opportunity to essentially raise taxes as an emergency measure. The IMF will have zero problem with this, right? I mean, the IMF doesn't have a problem with us raising taxes and not, as long as we don't spend more than we raising taxes. So that's what they should be doing, and curtail consumption until we have a better idea of how long this is going to last. That's what I think the immediate measure. One other thing I would suggest, and I think, Aaron, you mentioned the connectivity, the airlines. It's worth going back, I guess before I was born, my parents' generation, right? If you had to fly from Australia to UK, you flew through Colombo, right? Colombo was the middle point, right? And today what we have is, for Australasia European travel, 30-40% of that market is held by Gulf carriers, not Sri Lankan Airlines or a Sri Lankan carrier, right? And I don't think I see us trying to seize this opportunity. I mean, I think there's probably going to be a shift structurally away from the Gulf carriers to other carriers because of what's happened. Because people can see you can't completely depend on those carriers. So it's going to be a shift to other carriers internationally on those long-haul routes. Colombo is geographically perfectly positioned for this, but we see no response. I read yesterday there was an article saying that Sri Lankan Airlines is going to increase frequency of flights to Melbourne from 7 to 10. And you read the story, the explanation was, we're serving the Sri Lankan diaspora and some Indian students in India. Great. Why aren't they talking about the Europe-Australasia link, which we are well positioned to encroach into? So I think this is a big opportunity for us to break into that market, because even if the thing clears in a few months' time, we might still retain some customs. So I think that's what they're doing. But my sense is, again, successive governments have not thought this way, because I think they give directions to Sri Lankan Airlines. Cope gives directions to Sri Lankan Airlines. I don't know whether Sri Lankan Airlines has the planes now, because Cope actually interfered and stopped them buying planes a couple of years ago. I remember very clearly.
Maybe that's something we can talk about, the aviation capacity, and especially during.
But this is an opportunity.
Yes, especially during a former minister's term as Enterprise Development Deputy Minister. I think we'll have much to talk about. Well, Sri Lanka often speaks about deepening ties, especially business and economic ties with India. But we understand that there are practical challenges facing businesses, individuals, investors and entrepreneurs of both economies. And when we talk about this larger integration of the South Asian region too, we do see many challenges, both political and economic. But amid all this, especially when we talk about India and Sri Lanka, what challenges do you think those representing your organization face, and what interventions do you make and representations to the two governments?
So I will answer that slightly differently, Indeewari. I do believe that there is a mindset issue also in Sri Lanka with regards to integration and exploiting the Indian economy. And I think the mindset issue is primarily the fact that there's so much history with relation to India and Sri Lanka, some of it not very positive, that there is a certain kind of, I would say, suspicion of what the benefits of an integration will be. But I want to use this platform to actually make a very strong case for that integration. And I do think, for example, right now Bangladesh is reaping the benefits of having a pipeline for oil between India and Bangladesh. In fact, just as we speak, I believe 5,000 metric tons of oil is being sent from India to Bangladesh, in the current circumstances. If we start discussing connectivity between India and Sri Lanka, whether it's an oil pipeline, whether it's a land bridge, and I know bridge is a very contentious issue, whether it's the digital integration, which I think a lot of conversation is going around, I see in the next 5, 10, 15 years, Sri Lanka being in a much better position to handle these kind of shocks, because it's going to be somewhere economically connected to a larger neighbor who's actually on the economic way up. I mean, India, for all practical purposes, they're saying by 2038 is likely to be the second or the third largest economy in the world. We're talking of a current $4 trillion economy with a massive middle class who's now got the wherewithal to actually do purchases. So you have a market in your neighborhood. You have a market which is growing in your neighborhood. You have countries like the European Union, which have just signed an FTA. You have the UK, which has just signed an FTA. You have New Zealand, which has just signed an FTA. We've got Singapore, which has signed an FTA. But Sri Lanka is still on an FTA, which actually was conceived and agreed on in 2000. We are not moving beyond the FTA to something far more comprehensive. I think that movement needs to happen. I think this particular shock should be the stimuli for the powers that be to actually look at this Indian opportunity in a very different way and say, hey, you know what? We need to accelerate the economic integration conversation. Whatever form it takes, whether it's called ITCA, whether it's not called ITCA, whether it's called something else. Obviously, Sri Lanka needs to take care of its own concerns with regards to people mobility and all of those things. But beyond that, I think the movement needs to happen from Sri Lanka towards that
but do you think
economic.
This trust deficit could also be a reason, because there has been issues, there have been trust issues between the two nations, just as much as the two countries have been close. India has come to Sri Lanka's aid at multiple occasions. But at the same time, don't you think, as the bigger nation, that India should also be doing much to iron out those suspicions that maybe Sri Lanka has?
I personally feel that India has actually extended its hands out in the last few years, whether it's during the pandemic with the vaccine, Maitri vaccine, whether it's during the economic crisis with the $4 billion loan, whether it's at Ditwa. So there have been many cases where I think India has been very different from the India that was perceived what India used to be. But I think now it's time for the Sri Lankan authorities also to now start looking at the Indian opportunity and saying, hey, you know what, we need to now accelerate these things. We need to get this deal done. We need to move forward with the deals. We need to integrate our trade, supply chains. We need to make sure that the digital integration happens. We need to make sure that the maritime agreements happen. Basically, there are 5 big platforms on which the connectivity can happen. One is the physical connectivity. The second is the energy connectivity. I mean, there's a huge opportunity if we were to do the solar, and the renewables right, that you could actually feed a very power-hungry India, and that could become a huge source of foreign exchange and revenue for you in the future as well. So there are many areas on which I think India and Sri Lanka should have the conversation. To me, this particular shock should be the spur for closer engagement. At the end of the day, I think there are many examples. I told you about New Zealand, I told you about Canada, of countries which have actually exploited their larger neighbor for their benefit and benefited. I think we need to take those cases, look at those case studies and see how we can bite the bullet, and I'm using the word bite the bullet very consciously because there's such a lot of nervousness about that engagement, and say, hey, this opportunity we cannot miss. Because I think taking that call now will make the difference between, Sri Lanka being in a situation like this 5 years from now or not.
I'm told we don't have much time, so I'd like closing remarks from Mr. Wickramaratne and Dr. Ranan Elia too. I think I'd like to hear from you about the India question, and also I would like to continue on something Dr. Ranan Elia mentioned about an aviation hub in Sri Lanka. This was discussed post conflict. That was the plan for Sri Lanka. But at the same time, certain decisions were criticized. The COPE also reversed some decisions. But what are the potentials here? I mean, could Sri Lanka have done or taken different policy decisions at the time in order to enable probably air traffic towards Colombo and position Colombo or even another part of Sri Lanka, our airports, as a hub in the wake of a Middle East crisis?
There's referred to the FTAs that India has with many different countries. I was a young banker, probably the youngest member of the team, who 25 years ago actually worked on the background for that first FTA. Certainly, the government should move ahead and we should create an FTA with India. I think that's the way forward. It's a positive thing. I won't say more than that in the interest of time. On the air hub, I would say it like this. While the crisis has brought lots of issues and uncertainties of how we are going to deal with it short term and longer term, it also brings the opportunities, as I said. So one was a logistics hub, maritime hub. That's obvious. This is a great opportunity and we should look at it. But with specific reference to what Dr. Ranelli also said about the air hub, I think it's something that definitely should be looked at. While I was, for a very few months, Sri Lankan Airlines was put under me as State Minister of Finance, and I gave a report after consulting all the specialists in a very short period and made it public, and I gave it. And my fundamental thesis on that report on Sri Lankan Airlines, because it was referred to, is basically any business, you need capital. You can't run it on debt. And therefore, Sri Lankan Airlines needs to look for a partner. To be a national airline, you have to have 51% Sri Lankan ownership. I said 49% government ownership, 49% basically to the foreign investor. We give the other 3% to other Sri Lankans who can work with the foreign investor, because then we continue to be a national airline, and politicians have no hand in the management of the airline. And that's very, very fundamental. And I'm saying it as a former minister whom one of Sri Lankan Airlines was. And why I'm saying that is this: if we do that, right, then we basically open ourselves to the opportunity. It can be a maritime hub for sure, but opening it to other airlines and all that. But I think Sri Lankan Airlines itself could really prosper. Now, Sri Lankan Airlines is there. That's where the issue is. That's where the losses are. That's where the structural issue is. And then it has subsidiaries from engineering to ground handling to catering and all, which are more profitable. And the solution is not to sell those, but really the solution you have to find is for Sri Lankan Airlines, and therefore structure has to be carved out and the structure has been spelled out there. I think that we need to get away from these nonsensical things. Like there was an announcement that Sri Lankan Airlines is going to increase its capital. What is it doing? it's going to just make a rights issue, and the government of Sri Lanka is going to buy it. I think we need to really look at the structural issue and get out of it. And I think that there is,
but we did not find a suitable investor for Sri Lankan Airlines.
No. Not that we didn't find it. Not that we didn't find a suitable investor. Right? I won't go into the Emirates story, which everybody knows, which was under a previous government, and then overnight, they basically left. You see, so that's not the question. Always, right? There are equations which you will have to agree with. And those are down to negotiations and how you carve that out. But this proposal that was put was never followed through. It slipped back. And even now when you talk to people, they're talking about, we need to keep our airline, and as if this is a huge national asset. I got up in Parliament after I made that proposal, and I said, if there's anybody in this Parliament who wants Sri Lankan Airlines, I will give it to them at $1. Why did I say that? I said that just to make the point. It's negative net worth. You say, right? I was trying to just make the point that we need to get capital, we need to get partners, we need to open up. I was trying to make that point. And I know the President understands what I'm talking about. And I'm saying, let's go that route, right? Let's go that route with the airline. But I take the wider point. Becoming a hub is not only about your airline, it's about others also. Creating the environment for others also to come through here, Sri Lanka.
Right. Dr. Ranan Elia, you've spoken about the shocks, the challenges, and the immediate steps that we need to take. The question is whether we do have the capacity here to improve, especially when we talk about whether it's the aviation hub or maritime hub. And going forward, your closing remarks are also very important here as we discuss Sri Lanka's immediate to long-term solutions to the ongoing issues. As I began, the economy has faced multiple shocks, severe blows on the economy, but you spoke about a tax hike, a potential tax hike, but do you think the Sri Lankan people will be able to bear that cost?
So you raise a lot of different issues there. I think one issue I would say is we have a long-running governance problem, right? And the governance problem is of two types. There's a whole corruption and that kind of issue, and which I think this government has, I think, done reasonably well in trying to respond to public pressure and trying to address that, so that's fine. But there's this additional governance challenge, which is that we need a state that is able to proactively manage the development process, can see some of these international developments, proactively plan for them, can manage things like privatization. So the problem with the last Sri Lankan Airlines privatization, it was just very badly designed and done, and we didn't have the governance capacity to make sure it was a success. So we have to realize those capacity constraints, right? Now, in terms of taxes, I mean, I've said this in many venues. Let's be completely honest. Sri Lanka got into this mess where we were bankrupt, right? And we had to be bailed out by the IMF because successive administrations under all the major political parties essentially pursued crazy fiscal policies where they spent more than they could finance from taxes, and in the last few years they borrowed heavily on international markets, right? So this is a problem shared that was created. And so we need to listen to what the IMF, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the credit analysts have been telling us for the past 5-6 years. We don't raise enough money in taxes for a rapid economic growth strategy, right? If you want a capitalist economy that's successful, we need more taxes, right? That's what the lessons from Asia are. And even now, we've raised taxes because we're under IMF's control, and that's good because we need to do it. They need to tell us to do it, but it's only sufficient to stabilize. And I think the long-term challenge for this government is that it needs to raise taxes beyond the current IMF target. Mm-hmm. So I would take any opportunity I could to sell this politically, right? I mean, that's my view. And I think it's not just a challenge for this government, it would be for any other government. We're not going to be able to achieve long-term, rapid, sustained growth unless we raise the tax collections beyond the current IMF targets of whatever, 15% of GDP. We should be looking at 20% of GDP. It's politically very difficult, but it's a political challenge. So anything I would take, I would use this as an opportunity. And I think the government itself does not fully understand that. I mean, Aaron probably has more contacts with the MPP government than I do. I don't have any contacts, but I'm sure your colleagues in the parliament will know. I don't think they fully understand this, and I think the MPP faces a problem right now. It will face a problem in a couple of years' time. Many of its election manifesto promises cannot be funded because of that. So I think they should use the opportunity.
Yes, I'm told we don't have much time.
Sure.
Just a minute for your closing remarks, Santosh.
Well, I'm really looking forward. I continue to stress on the theme of closer connection with India. I think there are 5 areas: digital integration, physical integration, energy integration. These are the 3 important ones I would really emphasize, and I would think that together India and Sri Lanka should be able to take on some of the shocks much better, and it should help Sri Lanka to be closely economically integrated with India. And hoping that, having said that, for the sake of the region and for the sake of the future of the economic growth of the region in Asia becoming a really big powerhouse, I'm hoping that the war ends sooner rather than later.
Right, I think on that note, it's time we wrap up at Hyde Park for tonight. The challenge for Sri Lanka is not just navigating global uncertainty, but also addressing issues here at home and preparing for longer term consequences and other repercussions. I've had the pleasure of talking with the former Deputy Minister of State Enterprise Development, former member of the Committee on Public Enterprises and former State Minister of Finance, Mr. Iran Wickramaratne. Thank you very much for your time once again here at Hyde Park. We also had a conversation with Dr. Ravi Ranan Elia, Executive Director of the Institute for Health Policy, an economist and a physician, if I'm not mistaken. Thank you once again for your time. And Mr. Santosh Menon, President of the Lanka India Business Association, talking about the important role of the South Asian region and how Sri Lanka and India can work together. Thank you for watching. We'll see you again next week with yet another discussion. Have a pleasant evening. Good night.